January 8, 2020. It was just after dawn in Tehran, Iran. Inside Imam Khomeini International Airport, families hugged each other goodbye, students checked their passports one last time, and travelers quietly waited for boarding announcements. For everyone inside the terminal, it felt like an ordinary morning. Another international flight was preparing to leave, and nobody had the slightest idea that history was about to witness one of aviation's most heartbreaking tragedies. Ukraine International Airlines Flight 752 was scheduled to fly from Tehran to Kiev. From there, many passengers would continue their journey to Canada and other countries. It was a routine flight, operated by a Boeing 737-800, one of the safest and most reliable passenger aircraft in the world. The weather was clear, the aircraft had passed its inspections, and the crew was experienced. There was no warning that anything was wrong. But while passengers were settling into their seats, something far more dangerous was unfolding beyond the airport. Just a few hours earlier, the Middle East had entered one of its most tense and unpredictable moments in decades. The United States and Iran stood on the edge of a possible military conflict. Air defense systems across Iran had been placed on maximum alert. Military commanders feared that another attack could happen at any moment. Radar operators watched every movement in the sky, expecting the unexpected. Yet despite this extraordinary military tension, commercial flights continued to depart as scheduled. No evacuation, no complete closure of the airspace, no indication to passengers that the skies above them had suddenly become one of the most dangerous places in the world. At approximately 6:12 in the morning, Flight 752 finally pushed back from the gate. Inside the cabin, children looked out of the windows as the aircraft slowly taxied toward the runway. Some passengers listened to music. Others closed their eyes, hoping to catch a little sleep before landing in Kiev. Flight attendants completed their final safety checks, completely unaware that the next few minutes would change aviation history forever. The aircraft lined up on the runway. The engines roared to life. Within seconds, the Boeing accelerated into the cold morning air, climbing smoothly above the lights of Tehran. Everything appeared perfectly normal. Air traffic controllers watched the aircraft gain altitude exactly as expected. The pilots reported no emergency. There were no signs of technical failure. On radar screens, Flight 752 looked like every other commercial flight that had departed before it. But somewhere else, only a short distance away, another radar screen was showing a very different picture. Inside an Iranian military air defense unit, operators were working under immense pressure. They had spent the entire night preparing for what they believed could be an incoming American attack. Every unidentified object in the sky was treated as a possible threat. Every second demanded a decision that could mean the difference between defending the country or allowing an enemy strike to succeed. In that atmosphere of fear, confusion, and extreme tension, one ordinary passenger aircraft was about to be mistaken for something it was never meant to be. And within the next few minutes, 176 innocent people would unknowingly become part of a tragedy that the world would never forget. At 6:14 a.m., Flight 752 continued climbing steadily over Tehran. The aircraft had reached an altitude of around 8,000 feet and was following its assigned departure route. From inside the cockpit, everything appeared completely normal. The pilots remained in contact with air traffic control, and the aircraft systems showed no signs of trouble. For the 176 people on board, the journey had barely begun. Some passengers were reading messages on their phones before the signal disappeared. Others were looking through the window as the lights of Tehran slowly faded beneath the clouds. Parents comforted their children, and flight attendants prepared for the routine service that would begin once the aircraft reached cruising altitude. No one on board knew that, only a few kilometers away, a series of tragic decisions was unfolding. Inside an Iranian Revolutionary Guard air defense unit, operators were working under enormous pressure. Hours earlier, Iran had launched missiles at U.S. military bases in Iraq, and military leaders feared an immediate counterattack. Every radar contact was being analyzed as a possible hostile target. According to the official investigation, a breakdown in communication left one air defense unit operating with incorrect information about the direction of approaching aircraft. Because of that error, the operator reportedly believed the aircraft on the radar screen could be an incoming military threat instead of a civilian passenger jet. The operator had only seconds to make a decision. Normally, such a decision required confirmation through the chain of command. But in those critical moments, communication reportedly failed. Unable to receive a response in time, the operator acted alone. A missile was launched. Seconds later, it struck Flight 752. Inside the aircraft, there was no distress call. No emergency message. No warning to passengers. The first missile severely damaged the aircraft but did not destroy it immediately. Despite the catastrophic damage, the Boeing remained in the air for a short time. Investigators later concluded that the pilots were likely attempting to control the aircraft, even though critical systems had already been compromised. Then, about 30 seconds later, a second missile was fired. This time, the damage became impossible to overcome. The aircraft burst into flames as it lost altitude over the outskirts of Tehran. Witnesses on the ground described seeing a bright object moving silently across the morning sky before a massive fireball appeared. Some people initially believed they were watching a meteor. Others pulled out their phones, unaware they were recording one of the most devastating moments in modern aviation history. Within moments, the burning aircraft crashed into an open area near the town of Khalajabad. There were no survivors. All 176 passengers and crew members lost their lives. The world had just witnessed another aviation disaster. But unlike many previous crashes, investigators would soon discover something deeply disturbing. This was not caused by bad weather. It was not caused by engine failure. And it was not caused by pilot error. The truth would take days to emerge, and when it did, it would shock governments, aviation experts, and millions of people around the world. For the first few hours after the crash, confusion spread almost as quickly as the news itself. Iranian state media reported that a Ukrainian passenger plane had crashed shortly after takeoff because of a technical failure. Early reports suggested an engine fire. Since aviation accidents caused by mechanical problems were not uncommon, many people accepted that explanation without question. But outside Iran, investigators and intelligence agencies were already asking difficult questions. Something didn't add up. The Boeing 737-800 had an excellent safety record. There had been no distress call from the pilots. Air traffic control had received no report of engine trouble, and weather conditions were clear. If the aircraft had suffered a catastrophic mechanical failure, investigators expected to find evidence supporting that theory. Instead, new evidence began appearing almost immediately. Videos recorded by local residents showed a burning object moving through the night sky before crashing into the ground. Aviation experts who analyzed the footage noticed something unusual. The aircraft was already on fire while still in the air, something that did not match the initial explanation of a simple engine malfunction. As investigators reached the crash site, more questions emerged. The wreckage was scattered across a large area, but reports indicated that parts of the site had already been disturbed. Bulldozers were seen clearing sections of the debris field before international investigators had completed their examination. Around the world, aviation experts expressed concern because preserving a crash site is one of the most important steps in determining exactly what happened. Then satellite intelligence changed everything. Several Western intelligence agencies announced that they had detected the launch of surface-to-air missiles at the exact time Flight 752 disappeared from radar. Shortly afterward, multiple governments publicly stated that they believed the aircraft had most likely been shot down accidentally. The international reaction was immediate. Families who had lost loved ones demanded answers. Airlines reviewed their routes over conflict zones. Governments called for a transparent investigation. Pressure on Iranian authorities increased with every passing hour. For 3 days, officials continued to deny that a missile had brought down the aircraft. They insisted that technical problems were responsible. But as more evidence emerged, from satellite data to video footage and intelligence assessments, the official explanation became increasingly difficult to defend. Finally, on January 11, 2020, Iran made an announcement that stunned the world. The country's armed forces admitted that Flight 752 had, in fact, been shot down by 2 surface-to-air missiles fired by an Iranian air defense unit. The admission confirmed what many investigators had already suspected. This was not a mechanical failure. It was a catastrophic human error that had claimed 176 innocent lives. The question now was no longer what had happened. The question was, how could a civilian airliner be mistaken for an enemy target in the first place? The admission raised even more difficult questions. If the military knew the country was on the highest level of alert, why was civilian air traffic still operating? Why weren't commercial flights suspended until the situation became safe? And perhaps the biggest question of all, could this tragedy have been prevented? To answer that, investigators examined every decision made before, during, and after the incident. According to the official investigation, one of the most critical failures was a communication breakdown inside the air defense system. The missile operator reportedly believed the aircraft was approaching in a direction normally associated with a potential threat. Investigators later concluded that the air defense unit's radar had been misaligned, causing the aircraft's position and heading to be displayed incorrectly. Under normal procedures, the operator was expected to confirm any engagement with higher command before launching a missile. But that confirmation never came. Officials stated that communication with the command center failed at the most critical moment. Faced with only a few seconds to make a decision, the operator launched the missile without receiving authorization. Experts later argued that a single communication failure should never have been enough to destroy a civilian airliner. Modern military systems are designed with multiple layers of verification specifically to prevent tragedies like this. Many aviation specialists also questioned another decision. Why was the airspace still open? That morning, military forces expected the possibility of retaliation following Iran's missile strikes on U.S. bases in Iraq. Commercial aircraft continued departing from Tehran while air defense units remained ready to fire at what they believed could be hostile targets. As investigators completed their work, a clearer picture of the tragedy began to emerge. There wasn't a single mistake that caused Flight 752 to crash. Instead, it was a chain of failures: military tension, an active air defense system, communication breakdowns, human error, and perhaps the most important decision of all, keeping civilian airspace open while expecting the possibility of military action. Each mistake on its own might not have led to disaster, but together, they created the conditions for one of the deadliest aviation tragedies of the decade. The investigation concluded that the aircraft itself was fully airworthy. The crew had done nothing wrong. There was no evidence of mechanical failure that could explain the crash. Instead, the loss of Flight 752 resulted from missiles fired by an Iranian air defense unit that mistakenly identified the civilian aircraft as a military threat. For the families of the victims, however, the investigation could never replace what had been lost. Parents waited for children who would never return. Children grew up without their mothers and fathers. Universities lost brilliant students. Communities lost teachers, doctors, engineers, scientists, and friends. 176 lives, each with dreams, ambitions, and families waiting at the other end of the journey. In the years that followed, governments, aviation authorities, and international organizations studied the tragedy in detail. The incident renewed calls for stricter rules regarding flights over conflict zones. Many experts argued that whenever military operations are underway, civilian airspace should be closed immediately, even if the threat appears uncertain. Several airlines also reviewed their own risk assessment procedures, choosing to avoid certain regions whenever political tensions increased. The goal was simple: to ensure that no commercial flight would unknowingly enter the middle of a military crisis again. But despite those changes, one difficult question still remains. Was Flight 752 a preventable disaster? Based on the evidence presented during the investigations, many aviation experts believe the answer is yes. If the airspace had been temporarily closed, if communication systems had functioned correctly, if proper identification procedures had been followed, or if authorization protocols had not failed, the outcome might have been very different. History cannot be rewritten, but it can be learned from. Flight 752 reminds us that aviation safety depends on far more than modern aircraft and skilled pilots. It depends on responsible decisions made on the ground, clear communication, careful judgment, and the willingness to place human lives above everything else. Every time an airplane takes off, hundreds of strangers place their trust in a system they cannot see. Most of the time, that trust is rewarded. But on the morning of January 8, 2020, that trust was broken. Flight 752 was supposed to be an ordinary journey. Instead, it became a global reminder of how quickly fear, confusion, and human error can turn an ordinary flight into an unforgettable tragedy. And although years have passed, the memory of those 176 innocent people continues to remind the world of one simple truth. Sometimes the greatest disasters are not caused by machines. They are caused by the decisions people make. Thanks for watching. If you found this documentary informative, consider subscribing for more in-depth aviation stories and investigations.